Well, thank you. I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious conference. I'm just a simple PhD in economics. I don't have any expertise on the climate. I don't have any expertise on, big expertise on geostrategy. But it turns out that during my studies, I did a lot of work on the philosophy and sociology of sciences. And now I'm specialized in economics of development. And one of the aspects that nobody talked about during the Copenhagen summit was the development issues, that the type of policies that were being discussed were going to have on the poor people on this planet. Obviously, everybody was talking about saving the climate refugees and things like that, but nobody talked about very few people talked about the impact of green protectionist policies on the South, on the poor people. Let me start by a few remarks. Last year, this is my project, Un Monde Libre, eine freie Welt, I guess. It's part of the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, and we're trying to promote the ideas of free trade, economic integration, the rule of law, and things like that in the Francophone world, especially in Africa. Right. One of the things that Professor Vincent Cortillo talked about yesterday is the problem of the notion of consensus. And it seemed to me that the fact that some politicians or even some scientists, with the approval of politicians, could say the debate is over, okay, in a obviously very young and complex science in which scientists are not really able to take into account the role of, or they just start to take into account the role of clouds and things like that. And to say that the debate is over, we have the solution, was like very frightening for somebody who studied the philosophy of sciences and a big fan of Karl Popper. So I was like, what's that? Consensus is defined as a majority of scientists who decide that this is the consensus. And well, if you take the example of economics, especially 3 years ago, there are many things to say about it. The consensus was that everything was beautiful, the future was bright 3 years ago. I'll talk about that. The other aspect that nobody talked about was the geostrategic implications of Copenhagen. Everybody sold you that as a climate thing, but there are many interests behind that. People talked here about the renewable energy lobby. We could also talk about the green finance, because many people have an obvious interest in having carbon markets and things like that. Actually, 2 years ago, I took part in co-organized a conference in Aix-en-Provence, in France, about this issue of global warming. And most of the guys who came there were people from insurance companies and funds, and green funds, who were there to, to sell their product. It was a bit shocking to me. I don't have anything. I'm a liberal. I don't have anything against making money. I love it, no problem. But we have to be careful of what we're talking about. Let me start first with the consensus and the scientific process. The problem is that sometimes science is a process. Karl Popper described science as a process of exchange, a critical process in which scientists exchange and criticize each other. So you have a trial, you realize that you made a mistake, an error, and then you correct it, and it's an ongoing debate. And after a while, you have enough, proofs to say, well, maybe this is the truth. It's always uncertain that it's the complete truth, and this is how the scientific process goes on. So to close the process, like what happened in France, not only in France, was a bit disturbing. This idea of a certain consensus on one very complex question can be explained by the sociology of science and the economics of science also. We have what we call the cascades of information and cascades of reputation. It means what? It means that it's very difficult for a scientist to be objective. It's not the scientist who's objective. It's the process, the scientific process, that is objective. The objectivity comes from the process itself. It doesn't come from each of us, because we're just humans with cognitive limitations, even though we're scientists. So the only thing we can be is we can be honest. But to be objective is difficult for each of us as scientists. So the objectivity comes from the process. And to this regard, there's something that scientists don't like to hear, but we belong to networks. Even if we're a scientist, we only study one tiny part of reality. There's a huge specialization and division of labor today in science. And it's very difficult on such complex issues to have a global whole view and to be completely aware of the whole debate. So you have those non-rational processes, if you want, social processes in science itself that makes it that sometimes, the scientific process is not that rational and does not produce, is not a perfect competition, if you want to take an expression from economics. Why? Because, again, we are just humans and we belong to networks. So it takes time for the rationality of science to, apply, to do its work. And in the long run, it works. But in the short run, well, sometimes we take wrong sides just because we belong to networks and we have, again, filters in terms of information and filters in terms of reputation. Vincent Cotilliot or Claude Allègre in France can tell you about this. The campaign against the deniers, what was that? I always call it Ayatollah, well, whatever. Because, it turns out that by marriage, I'm a Shia Muslim, so it was pretty funny. But right, so the scientific process can have non-rational elements to it in the short run. And the sociology of science explains that pretty easily. This process is even reinforced when the general debate also stresses that type of idea, like global warming. And so you have some sort of pressure on the individual scientist. Say, if I don't defend this theory, it's going to be bad for my reputation. Yeah, there's a moral problem here for a scientist. It's not easy. And there's some sort of guilt. And if you have and a scientist is a human being before being a scientist, and he or she has access to the general information in the media, and that's also part of his brain. I mean, there's no way you can separate the two, being a human being. So that exerts some sort of pressure on the rationality of science. And to this regard, I think that the analysis of Thomas Kuhn 50 years ago in the structure of scientific revolutions was, well, not that completely stupid, if you want. He saw the evolution of science as paradigms, that is, social beliefs around one big theory, the paradigm, and then we started to see the failures in the paradigm, and we switched to another one. That's a fairly interesting vision of science, I think, that actually is not completely incompatible with that of Popper. I'm not a relativist. I do believe in the truth, and I do believe in the ability of the scientific process to discover the truth, but it takes time, and we have to take into account that there's no perfect scientific process. Another thing is about, Vincent Cotilliot talked about it yesterday, computer models. As I said before, economists have a lot to say about computer models. They all use the same models in finance, and all the models were okay, no problem, right? Well, we know that sometimes computer models can be limited by what you put into it, what you input in them, right? So we have to be very careful with that. Also with the concept of consensus in economics, as I said before, everybody thought, most economists 3 years ago would tell you, well, everything is fine. There's a beautiful debate on the internet, video on the internet, between a guy called Peter Schiff, who actually belongs to what we call the Austrian School of Economics, to which I belong to also. And there's a debate between him and Arthur Laffer in front of him, who's supposed to represent the mainstream. And he says, Schiff says, you know, we're going to catastrophe because you have taken responsibility out of the system and the system is going to crumble. And the consensus, which was represented by Arthur Laffer, was like, what are you talking about? We all agree on the fact that it's not a problem, that everything is beautiful. Even the IMF chief economist, another French guy, Olivier Blanchard, wrote a paper in June 2008. It gives you an idea of the very good timing, saying that the macroeconomic theory and macroeconomic policy was just beautiful, fine, no problem. Well, 2 months after that, boom. So we have to be really careful with that notion of consensus. Oh, by the way, the minority in that case was the catastrophists. So the problem is not with being a catastrophist, is to spot at the right issue. But I do agree also on the fact that on some issues, if you use catastrophe as a tool of disinformation, it can be problematic. Now, very quickly, a centralization of raw data, which was the case in the on the debate on global warming. Vincent Cotillo, I think, said yesterday, I don't remember if he said it or if it was another conference, another talk, that he asked many times the raw data that the climatic research unit had, because he wanted to work with them, because he thought they were weird. And this Phil Jones guy said, no, we can't disclose this information. But the problem is that when everybody has the same information, which is wrong, well, obviously it creates a problem. So you have a consensus, but on the wrong data. So obvious things. Now, so this can be limitations of the rationality of a scientific process internal to the scientific community itself. But now you can also have politics that gets into the way. And so I want to show you that because it's pretty funny. There's one thing you need to know, is that Sarkozy was the president of the Grenelle de l'Environnement. The Grenelle de l'Environnement is a big conference that was held 3 years ago at the Élysée, the Rue de Grenelle. Grenelle is the street where the Accord de Grenelle, the agreements of Grenelle, was signed after the revolution in 1968. So it's supposed to embody the social cohesion, social coordination, social dialogue between amongst the French, right? So, and this time was the Grenelle de l'Environnement. So we had many French people like Al Gore and people like that to agree on what France has to do on the environment. So the idea is that he's supposed to know what he's talking about because he spent 1 week with Al Gore. Maybe they, I don't know, did different things. Scientists from all over the world gathered during months and months in order to make a report. And this is a catastrophic report. The world is going to catastrophe if we continue to emit carbon, which creates a hole in the ozone layer. I did not invent it. He said it. So you might say, he's just a politician. No, but he's the guy who actually, and it's very serious. He's the guy who actually spent 1 week working with the people in charge of that. Well, obviously nobody talked about it. It's been removed from the internet, like, ooh. And in Le Monde, the day after, in Le Monde, the French newspaper, big newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung of France, there was only 3 lines about it, like, Nicolas Sarkozy confuses the whole ozone layer, and none of the journalists reacted to that. It was like, amen. I was like, what's that? So I started to think, but something wrong there. There's something wrong. How can such a stupid thing be said by the president of the Grenelle de l'Environnement, at that time, he was emitting a lot of CO2, flying all over the planet to convince his peers to sign the accord in Copenhagen. And he doesn't even know what he's talking about. Something wrong. A few weeks after that, it was the Climate Gate, by the way. And the Climate Gate in France was completely silenced by the media. So there's something wrong. After that, you had, this is Vincent Courtillot, in front of him, the guy with the back of his head is Borloo. And he literally jumped on Courtillot. So there was a lady from the WWF, there was Jouzel, and they all jumped on Courtillot, saying, the lady from the WWF said, but Mr. Courtillot, you are a negationist. Negationist means the people in France who deny the reality of the Jewish Holocaust. So it's a very strong term, right? And she said, this is a crime against humanity, not to believe that into the consensus. It's like, it's crazy, absolutely crazy. The journalist was really moderating, was really nice, saying, oh, don't say things like that. It's, we want to have a quite calm debate here. And Courtillot was really very calm, did a beautiful job. But they literally jumped on him. And one of the things used was the precautionary principle. They used this idea of the precautionary principle. But the thing is, if you read what is said on the precautionary principle in Hans Jonas and all that, this principle doesn't tell you that you have to invert your priorities. Because when we don't know about what's going on really with the climate. They say there's 90% of chances that this is true. Well, I'm not quite sure with the weather we have now. But there are things that we know for sure. Last month I was in Kyrgyzstan, and they know for sure that they have nuclear waste like that on the floor in the Fergala Valley. And this is a certain, 300% certain threat. We know it. So why should we concentrate all our resources on things we're not sure instead of things we're certain of? Kind of weird. I gave a lecture at the university on this, because we have a seminar in epistemology, and the local TV France 3 was there, and they invited me for a show with Bernard de Flessel, who's the guy, he's an MP, and he was in charge of writing the carbon tax and carbon markets law, French law. And he was the special envoy of the National Assembly to Copenhagen. And we had a debate on France 3, and he kind of tried to destabilize me, and it was quite unfair. I didn't like it, but it doesn't matter. And he's the guy who said I was an Ayatollah, because I said, maybe we can be skeptical. I didn't say it wasn't true. I said, maybe we're not sure about it. And after the debate, he pulled me apart from you see the people in the back, the people who there to clap, the click. I said, Mr. Martin. So he pulled me apart. It's not only about the climate. There's also some geostrategic interest, aspect. Sorry, you didn't say interest. Russia and all that. I said, yes, I get it. It's not only about the climate. Maybe it's not even about the climate. And then I came back home and I started to think about it. And the thing is, when you look back, there's been a whole lobbying by the French nuclear power lobby, because the nuclear power, France is the leader, okay? Well, they thought they were the leader. And it's supposedly clean energy. Everybody knows that. It's supposed to be CO2 free, right? Or very little emission. So if you look at what they did during the Grenelle de l'Environnement 3 years ago, they said very bad things about Germans, by the way. You stupid Germans, you don't understand that. Let me read that. 2 billion of tons of emitted CO2 are avoided today thanks to nuclear power and could be extended to 5 billion if the capacities already installed were reasonably developed. France is a good pupil with regard to CO2 emissions thanks to its nuclear policy. If all developed countries had had the same policy, avoided emissions would be of 7 billion of tons today, or a third of the current emissions. The Société Française d'Energie nucléaire is very clear that this type of efforts should be extended to all countries. Otherwise, the French alone, obviously, and Sweden, would not have any impact. It is very critical of Germany for having given up at the time its nuclear program and its decision to set up new fire plants. Blah, blah. Well, so you have a very intense lobbying of this Société Française d'Énergie nucléaire during the Grenelle de l'Environnement, which is supposed to be about the climate. Then in May last year, 1.5 years ago, we had a very big incident in the Tricastin plant, nuclear plant, very big issue. I'm not against nuclear power, but and the Prime Minister 6 months after that gave a beautiful talk on the necessity to export, because there's no problem with it, the necessity to export this type of technology abroad. So we have an Agence France Nucléaire Internationale, an international agency to promote French nuclear power, which is obviously another example of the lobbying of the sector. I don't mind lobbying, but it's don't use climate as an excuse. Then if you look at what happened with Union pour la Méditerranée, you know that Sarkozy launched this project of Union for the Mediterranean. And part of it was related to energy. And it was, we want to export nuclear power to Morocco, to Algeria. Algeria is a very safe country, everybody knows that. Egypt, also very safe. Well, Syria, yeah. But the thing is that this can be seen as not only a market. I understand the commercial aspect of it. And, well, with that type of energy, I think we should be very careful. But it's not only about a market. It's also about a new geostrategy. You know, Russia, we know that Russia is exerting some threat on Europe with gas. I mean, if you have the energy, you have the power. Simple as this. And I think that the French geostrategy was, in a way, to counter the Russian strategy. It's just an hypothesis, but it makes sense. I'm not saying it's the truth, but it really makes sense. Especially as the Russians are trying to divide Europe. They come to Germany and they ask Gerhard Schröder, would you like to be the chairman of the Nord Stream project? Oh, the French hated that. Said yes. Prodi said no, but actually Berlusconi and Putin are good friends, and so Russia is trying to divide Europe, and the French are trying to, they don't like that. They want to have a French plan. They have a French plan, energy plan for Europe. There are reasons why after Copenhagen the French started to slow down on this. There's another aspect to this geostrategy. These are very nice blokes, Sassou Nguesso, president of Congo-Brazzaville, and Ali Bongo, son of Omar Bongo, of Gabon. Sassou Nguesso actually just wrote a beautiful book on sustainable development. Not the sustainable development of his bank accounts in Switzerland. No, sustainable development. This man is, okay, I'll stop there, because sometimes it's difficult. I study with Africa, work a lot there, and to see that we can work with people like that is always a bit difficult for me. The thing is that those countries, and Niger, is this type of country. They have uranium, which is obviously something you need when you have nuclear power. So it's very important to make sure that you have friends in those countries, whatever the cost is. So we're just, continuing in this mafia type, and I know it's a strong word, but it's been like that for 60 years now, relationships between French politicians and African autocrats. You should know that the father of Ali Bongo, Omar Bongo, was actually chosen as the president of Gabon by General de Gaulle in '67. So he actually invited him at the Élysée just to test him, and okay. So that's a real African independence. But the thing is, now we have China in the middle. And it turns out that France has slowly lost Africa during for 10 years now. And I think you can relate the protection. Sassou Nguesso and Bongo were both elected in August last year. I mean, elected. I don't know, France was there as an observer only. We know that. Well, that's complicated, but, well. The other thing is that nobody talked about this, and this is a very important point in 30 seconds. The Copenhagen scheme was supposed to have some sort of compensation system. So I'm not going to go into details. But the thing is that on one side you have green protectionist policy. So you're like, no, you little African, you produce too much CO2. We're not going to buy this. Don't you want to save the climate? Okay, that's the first thing. Okay, but we are very good, so we're going to give you compensation for that. But as any observer of, any commentator of what's been going on in the aid industry for 60 years now, we all know where the aid money goes. It usually doesn't go in the pocket of the people. So if you have that sort of new system, aid system in the way, it's going to be even worse for the African people, not for the African autocrats, but for the people. And this was completely put aside in the debate, and I think from the point of view of development, this was a crucial aspect to it. The scientific process is influenced by internal and external issues and influences, and we should never forget that. I talked about the green finance, I talked about the nuclear sector, but I should also I didn't talk about the IMF and the World Bank. You know that green fund, the green compensation fund? They're fighting, they're struggling to get it, because it means more power for them too. Never forget that too. And if in 5 years we discovered that there really is no climate change, no global warming, do you think they will give the money back? No. They will keep the power and recycle and everything in something else. Actually, the IMF was supposed to be shut down in 1971 on August 15th when Nixon stopped the conversion of dollar and gold. That was the end of the Bretton Woods system, and that was the end of the IMF. Well, the IMF is still there and alive. Thank you very much.